This is the first in a series of week-long webinars raising awareness about invasive species in Washington as well as beyond. Governor Jay Inslee proclaimed Invasive Species Awareness Week in Washington in solidarity with National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And all across the nation, there are events going on raising awareness of invasive species and the issues that they pose in terms of damaging our economy as well as our environment. And we were really pleased that Governor Jay Inslee was able to proclaim the week and help us elevate this issue in Washington. And really am pleased to be bringing you all together for this Riparian noxious weed webinar today. All week we'll have a series of events, and if you would like to see that list, then go to invasivespecies.wasinwashington.gov as in government, and right on the homepage there's a button for Invasive Species Awareness Week, links to a news release as well as each of our week-long webinars in addition to the national webinar series. So invasive species damage our economy and our environment to the tune of billions of dollars each year across the United States. In Washington, we have a number of things at risk, from our trees to our water quality to our sensitive habitats such as riparian areas and all those species that rely on those being healthy in order to persist. And the number one thing that we would like everyone to take away from Invasive Species Awareness Week is awareness, being aware of what's around you, learning signs, symptoms, ways to identify invasive species, in addition to recognizing damage and signs of invasive species so that you can look at that damage and tell someone, which leads us to the second thing that we want everyone to do around Invasive Species Awareness Week. And that's, if you see something, say something. If you see damage that could be attributed to invasive species, if you see a species you don't recognize, snap a photo and report it. Don't be afraid to report something that is incorrect or native species. Our team of experts around the state love to educate people about the native species that are in Washington. And occasionally we'll find something new that we weren't anticipating. And your detection may be a first detection, enabling us to then mobilize response so that we can hopefully eradicate the problem before it becomes a long-term issue for us to deal with. We have a website that I invite you to check out. It's invasivespecies.wa.gov. We also have a really handy digital field guide called Washington Invasives that's available for Android as well as iPhones. And it functions as a digital field guide with a species profile for the majority of noxious weeds enlisted in Washington, as well as the priority insects and animals. And it's a great resource to pull up as you're hiking or recreating, see photos, see a description, as well as snap a photo and report the geospatial location of what you found. Any report that you send in immediately goes to the Invasive Species Council and our team of experts that are researchers or responders. So as I mentioned, this is the first Invasive Species Awareness Week webinar of Invasive Species Awareness Week. And I'm really pleased to be bringing together this team in order to talk about the intersection between land and water. And it's such an important habitat that supports a wide variety of plants and animals, including things that we really value, such as salmon and steelhead in Washington. Really important habitats that are vulnerable to invasive species. And today we're going to be talking about some of the invasive plants, also known as noxious weeds, that can damage those sensitive habitats. So we're going to lead off with a presentation from Jason Anderson. Jason is a riparian ecologist for the Still-Guamish Tribe of Indians. We will then follow up with a presentation from Ann Schuster, education specialist for the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board. Ann has species that are present both in Eastern as well as Western Washington to cover today. And then we have Brad Mead, invasive species coordinator for Clark Public Utilities, who's going to be talking about a common riparian weed that we're all going to be familiar with, whether we're in Eastern and Western Washington. And I'm really excited to be bringing this to you, and I really would like to thank our panelists for being involved in this. So one thing that I wanted to note is that the Washington State Department of Agriculture has awarded 2 pesticide license recertification credits to participants And when you were registering, if you were seeking credits, you put your pesticide license number into the registration form, as well as filled out your full name and your email. And what we're telling you is that you need to pay attention throughout the entire webinar. If you do not follow the instructions, you will not be receiving your credits. And that's really on you in order to participate and follow the instructions. So during the event, at some point, randomized through the presentation, will be a code word. It won't be a secret. We'll stop and the speaker with the code word will say it numerous times and point to a slide. So if you're paying attention, there's no reason why you shouldn't be finding the code word. And when you are prompted, we're asking you to enter the code word, your full name, and your pesticide license number into the chat box. And if you do not follow these instructions, you will not receive the registration credits. The way that we will proceed with awarding credits is that we will look at the registration list and we will cross-reference that with the saved chat log. And if you did not sign in or you did not register, then we have an issue. And then if you don't provide the code word along with your license number in order to validate that you're paying attention as well as present, then we can't be responsible for you not receiving your credits. So hopefully that's clear. It won't be a surprise and we'll make it as easy as possible, I promise. And with that, would like to jump right in. And the first presenter that we have today is Jason Anderson. So Jason, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow you to take over.
Excellent. Give me a minute here to get the screen sharing up and running. How does that look? Can everybody see that?
Yes, looks great.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much, Justin, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate the kind words. And I'm also pretty excited to be here for today and also for some of the other presentations that I see coming up in the days to come. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. A little bit of background before we get started. I want to emphasize that I come from the perspective of more of a practitioner involved in many aspects of riparian projects. So I've been involved with planning, design, funding, implementation, monitoring, our favorite, and reporting, of course. I've been doing this type of work for about 15 years. Currently, I work at the Natural Resources Department for Stillaguamish Tribe of Indians in Western Washington. So most of the photos in this presentation will reflect the basin in which I work. So with those two caveats, let us begin. So this is where I hope to focus my time with you today. I've got about 30 minutes to speak, and so I'd like to touch at a fairly high level on noxious weeds. I'd also like to discuss riparian areas, and then transition into integrated pest management, and then also discuss best practices for addressing noxious weeds within riparian areas. And then I'd like to discuss the concept of stewardship and traditional ecological knowledge. So a little background first. Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board defines noxious weeds as invasive, non-native plants that threaten agricultural crops, local ecosystems, or fish and wildlife habitats. And in general, it can include these types of plants, right? Everything from grasses to flowering plants, as well as aquatic plants, aquatic emergent plants, as well as wood stem plants like trees and shrubs. So in Washington at the state level, noxious weed control is a coordinated effort between many agencies, chief among them the state Noxious Weed Control Board, as well as county noxious weed control boards. Also the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And I would like to note, in addition to the state agencies, many tribes do have active invasive species detection and response programs in which they coordinate with the state and other agencies, federal agencies responsible for responding to invasive species issues. So when it comes to noxious weeds, the first question is, how do I know if I'm looking at one? So I would suggest it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with some common noxious weeds that may be present in the area where you live and work. So I've put a list together, a brief list. There's more options available besides this, but online resources could include something like an app, the one that Justin mentioned before, the Washington Invasives app. It's a great app, a lot of good color photos on there. Another one that I've come to rely on is EdMaps, very similar to Washington Invasives in the fact that they talk to each other, but a lot of really good information on both of those apps that you can download on your device and take with you out into the field. Some other online resources that are useful as well. Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board has a wonderful website that includes a link to identify noxious weeds. And check that out. Also, the iNaturalist website is good. And then the Burke Herbarium image collection contains just that, an immense collection of images that and searchable features and functions that allow you to try to dial in identification of a weed or a plant that you want to become more familiar with. And then, of course, don't discount print materials as well. Weeds of the West is a book that's been in print for many years, and it is really useful. I try to keep a copy of that with me in my office and sometimes in the field as well. So switching gears just a little bit here, what do we mean when we say riparian areas? So I'm going to give a quick definition so we can all be on the same page. Riparian areas are simply the lands that are adjacent to a fresh water body like a creek, a river, or a lake, as well as estuarine or marine waters on the coast, okay? And I like this graphic because I think it really succinctly shows what a riparian area is. Essentially, it's that transition between the aquatic ecosystem, whether that's the water body, the stream, the river, the lake, or the marine. Okay, that's that transitional zone as you're moving upslope. Okay, and then as you transition out of that riparian area, that floodplain area, you come into more of an upland area. Okay. So this graphic does a really good job of kind of depicting that change in vegetation that is very characteristic of a riparian area. You do have those shorter plants, the grasses, the sedges, the rushes, the short shrubby vegetation like willows or alder, and then some other vegetation, commonly plants and trees that is common in a riparian area like a cottonwood tree. And that's not to say that in some parts of the state, you won't have conifers growing adjacent to the channel or a lake, but in general, that's kind of the type of vegetation that you can expect to be in a riparian area. And we're going to focus now a little bit on the vegetation communities in riparian areas. And essentially, those vegetation communities are a function of many different factors. For example, geography. Geography can influence riparian vegetation. You can see those changes as you visit different parts of Washington state, north, east, southern, western Washington. All that different geography has different climate associated with it. And so, for example, in western Washington, the climate tends to be a little bit more marine influenced, and contrast that with the climate in central Washington, where you're on the Columbia Plateau. That's a lot drier, more desert-like. And so the vegetation that you're going to find within riparian areas is going to be different. That's a function of those two factors, as well as other things like topography, elevation. Those two factors can affect riparian plant communities. Other factors including soils, the substrate on which the plants grow, okay? Riparian soils do tend to be sediment in nature. They're depositional type soils, and they are influenced seasonally by changing water tables. That can be a flooding event or a high water event associated with snowmelt. Okay, so those water tables do change seasonally, and of course that is a factor that it influenced the riparian community. And one other factor that influences the vegetation community in a riparian area, biotic activities. Okay, and the biotic activities in general can include things above ground. That can be people, the human use, the human influence, as well as other influences. It can be animals grazing or browsing. It can be beavers. influencing that vegetation community. And also to say that there's a lot of subsurface activity going on in the soil. There's vertebrates burrowing in the soil, insects, fungal communities, as well as other microbial communities that influence the way in which vegetation grows within riparian areas. So the question now is, who or what benefits from riparian areas? Riparian areas are used by a variety of terrestrial animals, and that can include things like insects or birds, as well as mammals. People use riparian areas and gain benefits from them as well. Riparian areas benefit aquatic animals as well. Here's a photo of some salmon in a creek. Riparian areas contribute habitat forming factors, for example, large wood or shade to the channel. And so riparian areas do benefit not only terrestrial, but also aquatic organisms. So a properly functioning riparian forest composed of mature vegetation appropriate for the site provides ecosystem functions that benefit not only fish and wildlife, but also people. So let's break this down a little bit, okay? So as I mentioned in a previous slide, the riparian area can provide habitat for terrestrial animals. That can be in the form of cover or a migration or dispersal corridor. And it can also contribute habitat for aquatic organisms, okay? But then on the other side, we see these buffering effects of the riparian area, that floodplain area. It can buffer the effects of upland or upslope sources of either fine sediment or nutrients, and that helps ultimately to help keep water much cleaner. And that's good for people. Clean water is good for people. It's good for fish. It's good for wildlife. Those riparian forests and floodplain areas can also buffer the effects of energy in the form of, say, floodwaters coming from the aquatic area toward the upland area, okay? Those riparian areas and the vegetation communities there can help slow and dissipate floodwaters, store water, and help reduce flooding. And I think reducing flooding can be a good thing for people. So we have to ask the question then, what is the problem with having noxious weeds in riparian areas? Well, essentially, an invasion of noxious weeds can simplify the vegetation community, and this results in reduced diversity and reduced resilience. So noxious weeds essentially start disrupting natural processes that operate within the riparian area. These can be things tied to the water cycle, nutrient cycling, as well as energy flow, and then also community dynamics. And that can be a vegetation community, a floristic community, or even certain communities of fauna as well, bird communities or other communities. Beaver example is another one that could be disrupted when you have a noxious weed invasion. So then the question is if noxious weeds are undesirable in riparian areas, well, what do we do about it? This is where integrated pest management comes into play. Now, this refers to managing all types of pests, and it essentially is a combination of practices to control an unwanted pest. So I'm going to insert plant here so we could reterm this as integrated vegetation management. But in general, we're going to follow 4 basic steps, and those are identify and monitor the plant. You're going to set a threshold. Next, you're going to practice prevention. And then the last step is control. And then repeat those steps as necessary in an iterative fashion. So let's go through here step by step. Step 1, identify and monitor. Essentially, you need to get out on the landscape and conduct periodic vegetation assessments. You want to become familiar with common native as well as non-native plants in your area. Okay? Oftentimes, you don't know exactly what you're looking for when you're going out and doing your vegetation assessments. You're not looking for that one particular weed. You don't necessarily know what's there. What you might be looking for is something that's new or unfamiliar. Okay. And that's why becoming familiar with native plants and noxious weeds is a good first step before you go out and start doing your vegetation assessments. Okay, noxious weed identification. How do I know if I'm looking at a noxious weed? Well, again, you can use one of the wonderful apps like Washington Invasives or EdMaps. Super useful, super easy to use. I would also say that you can get in touch with your county noxious weed control coordinator or your county noxious weed control staff. Really good information, very, very proficient at their jobs. They will be able to help you determine if you see a noxious weed, what you're looking at. Another source of information that's very, very useful, Washington State University Extension and the Master Gardener programs. Master gardeners are trained at plant identification and can help you in getting your observations to the right people who can determine whether or not you're seeing a noxious weed and verify that it is indeed a noxious weed. And when in doubt, when you're out, take a photo. Now, I want to share with you the photo on the side of the screen here. If you look closely, this is a photo I took. I was out shopping at a local nursery with my wife. We were looking for geraniums, and I see this beautiful yellow flower in a pot a couple tables down. And I thought to myself, that looks familiar. I'm going to go look at that. So I did. And I walk over there and I look at the tag. And if you get close to your screen, you should be able to read Sister Golden Hair, drought tolerant Scotch broom, for sale in a pot. So I snapped a photo of it. I reached out to Justin at the Washington Invasive Species Council, as well as the county noxious weed coordinator for the county in which I live. And I asked them about what I should do, and the information was then sent. And I believe the resolution was that a Washington State Department of Agriculture plant inspector was going to the nursery to address the situation. So the point is, when you see a plant that you suspect may be a noxious weed, do some homework, try to figure it out, and then follow up with the people who can help you. Okay, so step 2, after we've gone out and determined that you actually have a noxious weed is present on one of your sites, then you need to set an action threshold, okay? It's a good idea when you're out doing your assessment to take some basic information, estimate the number of plants or measure the area in which the plants are growing, okay? Sketch a map, make some notes on access so you can return to the site in the future. If you are using an app, a lot of this information will be contained within the observation, and you'll have the geospatial data recorded that you can refer to or that other people can refer to when they go to find that weed, okay? The basic information that you want to collect will enable you to figure out what your action threshold is, okay? Essentially, you want to figure out how much of that particular plant is tolerable on the site. It may not be necessary to absolutely eradicate every single weed that you discover on every one of your sites. That might not be possible. In fact, it might be impossible. And so to figure out whether or not you are able to set a threshold that is tolerable is you need to learn a little bit about the different classes of weeds in Washington State. And so I took some information from the Washington State Noxious Weed Control List. And we have 3 basic classes of weeds. We have class A, B, and C. Okay, so basically class A is of limited distribution in Washington. And I tend to think about this, I tend to think about this as the types of weeds that are newly introduced to Washington, and we better get them under control before they get out of hand. And these class A's eradication is required by law.
Jason, this is Justin. This is your 5-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. Well, then I'm going to have to skip ahead a little bit. So I'm going to go a little bit quicker. I think I got a little bit wrapped up in my story from earlier. So moving ahead, step 3 is prevention. I would say an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. If you find sites in which you do not have noxious weeds, consider doing prevention strategies to prevent them from becoming established. Step 4 is plan and control. Once you determine that a threshold has been exceeded, make a control plan and implement the plan. Best management practices. In general, we follow 4 best management practices when it comes to weed control in riparian areas: manual, mechanical, biological, and chemical. Manual is essentially hand pulling, cutting, or digging. Mechanical is using equipment or machinery to mow or cut the weeds. Biological control is generally introducing an organism to graze, browse, or eat the weeds. One of my favorite calendars, goats and trees. Chemical methods involve using herbicide to control weeds. And always use caution, follow label restrictions when you are conducting herbicide applications within riparian areas. Why choose best practices? Well, best practices have been proved to achieve your weed management goals, operate safely for workers and neighbors, and minimize impacts to natural resources. And in the end, we do have goals for conducting weed control within riparian areas. Improve habitat. We want to allow those processes to function unhindered. And oftentimes we want to improve native vegetation conditions. That would be the structure and composition or the diversity and resilience of plants. So are we done yet? We're getting there. I'd like to introduce the concept of stewardship. Stewardship in basic terms is taking care of what you have and trying to make it better over time, okay? Stewardship is generally not aimed at completely eradicating weeds, but managing them so that the ecological processes are allowed to proceed without intense intervention on the part of the land managers. And the practice of stewardship is rooted within traditional ecological knowledge. And essentially, this is a body of knowledge that is dynamic. It is often held by the locals or the folks who are native to an area, quite often seen as tribal members, indigenous peoples, First Nations. And much of this knowledge is essentially based on oral tradition and practices. Emphasis on practices. These are management techniques, best practices, okay? These are the types of practices that are seasonal, regional, and intentional. So with that, I'd like to introduce practitioners' ecological knowledge. As a practitioner, I like things that are practicable, that is able to be done or put into practice successfully. And they're also practical, dealing with actually doing something, the use of something, as opposed to simply based on theory or ideas, okay? So I'd like to challenge you to develop your own practitioner ecological knowledge. And you're gonna do that by going out into the riparian areas, these critical areas, observing plants through the seasons, searching for noxious weeds, adopting integrated pest management practices, the 4 steps that we talked about earlier, following the best practices. And I would suggest letting traditional ecological knowledge be the foundation upon which you build your practitioner ecological knowledge. So if we do look to traditional ecological knowledge as best practices, then we begin to manage riparian areas for the good of the resources and people benefit. So if you ask the question, should we manage riparian areas? I'd say, yes, we should manage riparian areas as we would other parts of the landscape with care, diligence, and a sense of place and purpose. So in closing, when we choose to act as stewards of the waters, the land, fish, wildlife, and other natural resources, we will do so and be mindful of generations to come. And at the end of the day, people will also benefit from the healthy land, the healthy water, the diversity and the abundance that follows. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I will turn it back over to Justin.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jason. That was really inspirational and I think really brought home, why we're concerned about managing noxious weeds in these riparian areas. And I've got some questions for you, and I'm sure everyone else does too. Go ahead and hold your questions until the end, and we'll stop screen sharing. All the panelists will show their video, and you'll have an opportunity to ask all your questions at the end. So thank you, Jason. And up next, we have Ann Schuster. Ann, go ahead and share your screen when you're ready.
Okay. It is loading on my end. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to go over some more common invasive plants in Washington riparian habitats that are, for the most part, found on both sides of the Cascades. So most of my knowledge comes from restoration done on the west side. But I talked with a colleague, friend, Evan Doolin, who I believe I saw in the participants list, who is a wetland biologist for the Washington State Department of Transportation, on some tips for eastern riparian weeds. So shout out to him for some species additions and ideas. So first, I'm going to go through reed canary grass. I'm sure everyone has seen it, and if you don't already know what it is, grasses are difficult to identify, so I'm not going to go too much into how to identify grasses, but it's very common all over Washington. It is a class C, so Jason started to go over classes earlier in his presentation and ran out of time, but class C weeds are very prevalent, very common, and they're so widespread that it's not really economically feasible to control them. So they're a noxious weed, and some locations, some counties choose to require control on some of those species, but they're not required for control anywhere, at least on the state level. It's in the grass family. It's a perennial, which means it comes back year after year. And it reproduces by seed as well as by creeping rhizomes, and also can come back from shoots and roots when you cut the stems. So it is pretty good at getting back into an area. To identify it, it can grow really tall. So over 6 feet tall. The blades, that's the flowering stem, can get over 6 feet tall. The blades of the leaves are flat and hairless, 1/4 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch wide, kind of long drooping. There's also a ligule, which is a papery bit where the leaf of the blade leaf of grass attaches to the stem, and that is one of the ID features for reed canary grass, as well as lots of other grasses, depending on the size and what it looks like. But for reed canary grass, it is thin, almost transparent, and 4 to 10 millimeters long. So that picture's been zoomed in quite a lot. That's pretty small. The stems and branches are round. They can get up to 6 feet long and 1/2 an inch wide, so pretty sturdy. They're usually hollow, and they're green, perhaps with some reddish brown towards the top. And the flowers start green and they age to brown. So those are pictures of grass flowers. If you don't know, grasses make flowers. They just don't look as showy as the flowers we're used to. But they spread out as they age through the season, and the anthers kind of pop out. The flowers are really densely clustered in those panicles, and there's 3 florets per spikelet. So these are all grass terminologies that you can look up, or maybe someday we'll have a grass ID workshop. But grasses always have really unique identification names because they're so weird and unique compared to other plants. But it's basically, you need to measure every little bit of every part of the grass to make sure that you are identifying it right. However, reed canary grass is very common, and if you think it's reed canary grass, it's likely the reed canary grass. It takes over lots of areas, and also mostly flowers in May to June. For impacts, it was listed originally because it is a really major threat to natural wetlands. It outcompetes almost all native species. It forms large single species stands, and it outcompetes all the other species. These stands are really dense, and they have very little habitat value for wildlife. And its invasion can also cause real problems with irrigation, especially in irrigation ditches, and causes a buildup of silt and lots of other problems with flooding and that sort of thing. They grow in saturated soils and also near saturated soils, especially in the where it's saturated during the growing season, although well-established stands can survive in very dry areas. So if you see them in a dry area, it maybe is just a very well-established stand that has been wet in the past. To control it, I'm going to go through kind of a few different methods of control for each of one of these species, because as Jason said, you want to be able to choose the best option for your area, especially with riparian plants, where you might not be able to use chemicals because of local regulations about using herbicides near waterways and aquatic areas where you will need a special permit to use herbicide there. So you want some other options rather than just herbicide for a lot of aquatic area plants. For reed canary grass, mowing can remove the seed heads, especially if you do it twice a year, and then help increase native plant populations. If you were to cut it and then tarp it, it won't eliminate the problem, as the grass is really strong and can grow right through the tarp for the most part. Cultural control would be prescribed burning. So that is an example of traditional ecological knowledge, as Jason was talking about. Prescribed burning in the early spring or in the late spring or early summer, as well as in the fall, is great, especially when combined with another method like chemical control or a mechanical control. Is really great for controlling reed canary grass. So if you do choose to use chemical control, with all of these plants and with any chemical control you choose to use on plants, always follow your label directions, always make sure you know the local regulations and laws pertaining to that habitat and that species. Make sure you're using everything correctly and safely. Make sure you're wearing correct personal protective equipment. And so that's going to apply for anytime I mention chemical control throughout this whole presentation. But timing is the most important aspect for deciding how to control reed canary grass. Most chemicals are only effective after 2 to 3 years, and sometimes they stop being effective after that period, depending on how resistant the grass gets to that chemical, which can happen very easily. Most sites will end up being reseeded with reed canary grass from an adjacent stand or from the seed bank. And as I said, be mindful of regulations and label directions near aquatic habitats. The next plant I'm going to go through is purple loosestrife. This is a class B, so that means it is a little bit more widespread than a class A, but not nearly as widespread as a class C weed. So like reed canary grass was class C. So purple loosestrife, being a class B, it is required for control in certain parts of the state, but not all parts of the state. So certain counties have selected it for control, and other counties, it's been assigned control to have mandated control by the state board. So it is a perennial, it's herbaceous, it spreads by seeds, rhizomes, and also vegetation fragments. So bits of it can wash downstream and form new stands very easily. They grow up to 10 feet tall, but usually a bit shorter and 5 feet wide, but usually like they're 3 to 6 feet tall. The leaves are opposite or in whorls of 3, so that's 3 leaves coming out from basically the same level on the stem. The stems are upright and branched and are 4 to 6 sided, kind of like things in the mint family have the sides of the stem. And they'll have really a lot of stems, and those flower bunches will be at the end. Those flower bunches are really dense, 4 to 16-inch spike of magenta flowers, and they each have 5 to 7 petals. I'm going to go through some lookalikes of purple loosestrife that people often get confused with. So almost all these are native except for butterfly bush. So fireweed is a native plant that grows in drier areas than purple loosestrife. It has a round stem. It has not nearly as dense of a flowering spike. And the petals, I believe it has 4, maybe 5 petals. Cooley's hedge nettle is another lookalike. It is in the mint family, and it grows in similar places. It likes wet areas, and it's pretty short. It's not bushy. It's a mint family, so it has square stem, and I believe they're hairy, and the leaves kind of look like a nettle, which is why it's called Cooley's hedge nettle. It kind of looks like a nettle, but it is not a nettle. The next plant often confused with the purple loosestrife is spirea, or also known as hardhack. Another native, this is a shrub. It leaves behind woody bits in the winter after it loses its leaves. And its flowers are really dense, kind of fluffy, fuzzy clusters of very small pink flowers. So not big like the purple loosestrife. And then the last plant that can look like purple loosestrife is a non-native, and it's butterfly bush. So this is also a class B weed in Washington. And this is another shrub. It has a round stem, and the flowers can vary in color, but often they're purple, or like a cool shade of purple rather than a warm pink purple like purple loosestrife. And those flower bunches are very tight, and the flowers are pretty small. So those are some ways to tell apart things that look like purple loosestrife. Impacts of purple loosestrife is that it is a really vigorous competitor and can outcrowd other vegetations, including native species. It really quickly dominates a site and adapts to environmental changes very well there. Purple loosestrife stands provide very poor cover for wildlife and other habitats, like other wetland species. It's an emergent aquatic plant, so you're going to find it where it's wet for the most part. Here's a picture of purple loosestrife along with garden loosestrife, which is a fairly closely related species that has yellow flowers instead of purple ones. So they co-occur, which is great because they're both awful invasives. To control it, you want to do mechanical digging for small infestations. You'll want to remove all plant parts from the site and dispose of them properly. Cutting isn't an option alone because they can resprout. For biological control, there are loosestrife beetles and weevils that feed on different parts of the plant depending on the species of insect. And those are being released by WSU. So you can contact their biocontrol program if you have a large population of purple loosestrife that you want help controlling and you think biological control would be a good option. So for chemicals, as with all aquatics, there's special regulations and permits required for aquatic habitats, and you'll want to check with your local weed control board to make sure that you are within the law and that you can get permits or find somebody who has the right permit if you do choose to use chemical control, because these are almost always in aquatic areas. Next, a bunch of species I'm going to go through are knotweeds. So there's quite a few species in Washington. They're all class B. They're all perennial. They're herbaceous technically, but their bamboo-like stems persist through winter, so they're kind of like shrubs. Also, they're really, really big. And they reproduce mostly by rhizome, although as well as by plant parts that break off, especially in riparian areas where they'll float downstream and form another stand. As you can see that picture in Whatcom County. To identify them, they are 6 to 12 feet tall, so they're pretty big. Their leaves are egg-shaped to heart-shaped with pointed tips. Their stems are pretty stout and hollow. They kind of look like bamboo, whereas the dormant stems are reddish-brown. So this time of year, they've lost all their leaves and their stems have died back from last year, and you might see stands of brown, dead-looking bamboo. And that's what they look like right now, but in a few months, they'll be big, bushy knotweeds full of these white flowers, these like very numerous spikes of white flowers that are very, very popular with pollinators. So those will come out in July and August. Impacts of knotweeds are that they are a really serious problem for riparian areas. That is a map of all knotweeds in Washington as of 2016. So that is not current, but it gives you a good idea that they are present throughout the entire state. They displace native vegetation, they erode stream banks, they absolutely do not hold onto soil very well. They alter the nutrient cycle, and they also lower habitat quality for fish and wildlife. So they let lots of silt into the water, they die back in the winter. They are they push out all the native plants. It's really tough to be a fish in an area that has a lot of knotweed. They have a really rapid spring growth and deep excessive roots that outcompete other species. And roots can damage roads, foundations, and other structures, as you can see in that picture taken in Seattle. I've seen a video of a family in England struggling with knotweed coming up through the foundation of their house and ruining their utility room and just continually breaking through their utility room floor. It's really terrible as far as how strong it can grow. To control it, you can use mechanical methods. Digging up plants can work for small isolated plants, but you need to remove as much of the root as possible. Otherwise, it will regrow. You can make the problem worse if you don't get all of the parts of it. You want to cut this. If you do cutting, you can cut the stems every 2 to 4 weeks until plants go dormant, but you'll have to repeat that for 5 years. A similar thing with that is you can cover them with a heavy duty tarp, and then you'll want to stomp on that every few weeks for multiple years. And that can eventually get rid of the population. Chemicals are a good option for them. You can use glyphosate or imazapyr, they're effective. And if you are using those chemicals directly by either injecting them into the stem or putting it directly on the leaves in places where it doesn't overhang an aquatic habitat, then those are good options, especially for smaller areas where you don't have to spray everything. And the best time to do chemical control on knotweeds is July and August. And you'll also have to do more monitoring and retreating after, because they'll keep coming back and you have to do it for quite a number of years. So I'm going to go through a few species of jewelweed altogether. Jewelweeds and also policeman's helmets is a closely related species that's pink instead of an orange or a yellow. They are all annuals, they're herbaceous, and they only reproduce by seed. Their size varies depending on the species, with policeman's helmet being the tallest. Their leaves are all teardrop to egg-shaped with rounded to pointed, serrated and lobed edges. The stems and branches are upright and succulent, so they kind of have that like stiff, mushy when you if you break them or pinch them. And policeman's helmet can get a reddish tint, especially when it gets more sun. The flowers hang from thin stems, and you can see on this picture, they have a top lobe and then a bottom 2 lobes, and on the front of their petals and on the back, they form kind of a cone with a spur at the back. So that is how jewelweeds generally look. And their fruits are smooth capsules with ridges going long ways, and that's for all the species. But we do have native species of jewelweed. So for the most part, you can tell them apart by their color. We don't have any native jewelweed species that are pink, so that's for policeman's helmet. Small flower jewelweed are very small and very pale, although it's still hard to tell apart from our native jewelweeds that are mostly yellow and can be very small. And then the last invasive is the spotted jewelweed, which has pretty apparent orange spots and sometimes so thick it looks like veination along the front petals, whereas our native jewelweeds might have some orange spots. They're not that apparent. There's not that much, and they don't occur everywhere on the flower. They really only occur on the inside of that cone. But it's always good to take a picture, send it to the Noxious Weed Control Board, either the state level or your county level, and we can help you figure out exactly what type of species you're dealing with. All of them quickly invade riparian and wetland areas. They form really dense monocultures, taking over the entire herbaceous understory layer. Spotted jewelweed is able to hybridize with our native jewelweeds, so that's not good. Small flower jewelweed is able to survive in drier and upland habitats, so not just riparian areas. And they also may have allelopathic effects, which means that they have chemicals that hinder the growth of nearby plant species. So that's another way that they're able to form those big monocultures, and another reason why they're really bad to have around and that we want to control them. Jewelweeds have really shallow roots, so they're really easy to pull up. Because they don't reproduce vegetatively, if you get the root, it's not going to keep growing. So mechanical control is a really great option. There's no biological control approved in Washington currently. You can plant competitive desired species. Things can outcompete them if you really get them a good head start and really get rid of as many jewel weeds as you can. And there isn't a whole lot of information on chemical control on jewel weeds, but it's a good option if you have a large population where you can't go through and pull them all up. And if you're going to use a foliar spray, make sure you're treating when pollinators aren't present, or at least when they're not very active. And as always, follow label directions and local regulations, especially if you're near an aquatic habitat where you might need a permit. Next species I'm going to go through is common teasel. This is a class C, and they are biennial or short-lived perennial. So pretty much they flower once in their life and then they'll die. But usually that happens over the course of 2 years. They'll have a rosette in their first year and they'll flower in their second year, although that can all happen in the same year. And they reproduce only by seed. They make that rosette in the first year and they look kind of like ancient dinosaur plants. They have wrinkly leaves and they're really kind of spiky with really thin, not very sharp spikes on those rosette leaves. And then those will die back when it makes the flowering stalk, and it will have really pointed leaves that have spines, especially on the bottom, that grow up the flowering stalk, and they hug each other around the stem, kind of forming a cup that can collect water. And those leaves are all green with like a really light midvein. The stems and branches are green to red, depending on how much sunlight they're getting. The stems are hollow or sometimes pithy, and they get more and more spiky the closer to the top of the plant you get. The flowers kind of look like cones. They're not a true cone, but I'm using cones to describe what they look like. They can be up to 4 inches and are green except for a dense ring of pink-purple flowers that mature up the cone throughout the season. And the cone bases are surrounded by uneven, long, thin, spiny bracts, as you can see in that picture of a hand holding one. They spread out to be more like an open palm once it starts flowering with the purple ring of flowers. The roots are really stout, fleshy taproot that can be up to 2 feet long. And it's good to, I mean, those really form in the rosette stage, and it's good to get those out then. Impacts are that they quickly invade and outcompete native and desired vegetation, including in agricultural fields, so not just in riparian areas. They like disturbed sites, agriculture, livestock, and they're not great for livestock since they're so spiky. Each flower head can produce 850 seeds, which can stay viable on the cone for a long time. And you can see in that picture, they'll germinate on the cone. And then if that cone gets spread, those seeds and those germinates can go everywhere and get into the soil. It's best to manually control these at the rosette stage if you can. If you are going to mow them, you'll want, or remove the seed heads, you need to dispose of them really well because they will contain a lot of viable seed that can stay viable for many years. Cutting will need to be done multiple times if you decide to do that during the flowering stage, because they can just keep on sending up new flowering stems until they're done. There's no biological control approved in Washington. They are outcompeted by competitive grasses and desired plants. So if you can get a healthy stand of vegetation that you want, that's great, and they'll push these out. The rosettes are easy to control with herbicides as well as by mechanical methods or manual methods, such as 2,4-D, imazapic, and others, but you'll have to treat an area for several years to deplete the seed bank because they can stay in the seed bank for quite a few years.
And this is Justin. Sorry to disrupt you. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, that's great. I'm on the last species, or last 2 species. So the last couple species I'm going to go through are bull and Canada thistle, and they are in the sunflower family. Bull thistles are biennial and Canada thistles are perennial. They're both herbaceous, and bull thistles reproduce by seed only, whereas Canadian thistles reproduce by seed and by rhizome. I'm going to tell how to tell them apart, even though it doesn't really matter. The bull thistles are much bigger, much spikier. The leaves have large lobed edges, and they have really sharp spines. The underside is covered in kind of white woolly hairs, and the upper side has more of those stiff spines. The stems have spined ridges or wings that run along the stems, and the flowers are really big, so 1.5 to 2 inches wide, with a tuft of pink to pink purple flowers at the top, with the spiny bracts forming a bulb shape underneath. And the seeds, as with many things in the sunflower family, spread on the wind like dandelion seeds as you poof them. And Canadian thistle looks kind of similar, but a lot smaller, kind of just less intimidating. They are 1 to 4 feet tall, and they also start out as a basal rosette and then grow up. So the leaves grow up along the stem and are lanced to oval shaped with deep lobes or tooths, which have spined tips that are not as imposing as bull thistle, but are just as sharp. So if you're going to be controlling any of these, gloves are just a good idea. The flowers are a lot smaller. They're not even an inch wide, and they're pink to light pink with the frilly tops and the spiky green bulb formed by bracts below, and they're really just a lot smaller and a lot less spiky than the bull thistle. Both of them impact basically the entire state. They quickly outcompete desired plants such as native vegetation and livestock foliage. They are in a wide variety of open and disturbed habitats, not just riparian areas. One bull thistle plant can produce 4,000 wind dispersed seeds each year, so that's a lot. And also, just a little factoid, the first noxious weed law in Washington was made for control of Canada thistle, and that was in 1881 when Washington wasn't even a state yet. So Canada thistle has been a problem in the state for a long time. To control them, this is for bull thistle specifically, cut or pull the plants after they start to grow. Also, you can cut the flowering stalk. Cutting should be done at least 1 inch below the soil. You can mow before flowering starts, but you'll have to do repeat mowing and pulling in following years to deplete the seed bank that's in the soil. They are outcompeted pretty easily by plant species, so that's a good cultural control option. And glyphosate, triclopyr, 2,4-D, dicamba, aminopyralid can all be effective on active growth, especially before flowering, especially on that basal rosette is when you'll want to do that chemical control. And then to control Canada thistle, it can be really difficult to control it manually because any soil disturbance really helps the rhizomes spread and also stimulates the seeds to germinate. They can be pulled carefully or repeat mowing can be done to eventually be effective, but that takes a long time to really weaken that rhizome structure underneath and deplete it of nutrients. Biological control, there are a few species of weevil and galling fly that have been introduced, though they're not providing a whole lot of control, we've found, so that's not something that's really actively being pursued as an option. And if you're going to control Canada thistle with chemicals, you should really only spray during active growth or regrowth to have an impact. And that is all. Thank you.
Great. Well, fantastic, Ann. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that people have a lot of good questions for you during the Q&A period at the end. I'd also like to thank you for putting in Clippy, the animated assistant. I actually did a little research and figured out that its name is Clippy. So that's a really fun thing. I was clicking my screen. I don't know if you could see that. Well done. Thank you. So next up, we have Brad Mean. Brad is the invasive species coordinator for Clark Public Utilities, and Brad is going to talk about integrated pest management of Blackberry.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to talk about Blackberry control. I'm not going to get too into the weeds with the identification or how to control it in an upland site. We're going to focus primarily on the riparian area. And with that, let's get going. As you've probably guessed, I will be the person giving you the code word. However, I'm going to be rude about it and make you work for it a little bit. The code word is on this picture somewhere, and you'll have to stick around a little bit longer to figure out what that is exactly. So controlling blackberries, there's no real way that you could possibly eradicate blackberries beyond a landscape scale. It's just such a prolific plant that really what you should be looking at is how can you remove it from that particular site that you're working on and increase the ecosystem services that are available there. Replanting is 100% necessary, and you're going to have to be very vigilant about doing follow-up maintenance treatments on any regrowth that will most certainly come up. Regardless of how perfect your treatment is, there will always be plants coming up. That's just the nature of the beast. So there's a lot of things you want to consider before you really dive into treatment. And it's really important to do this every site that you look at. The big ones are soil, ground nesting birds, pollinators, fruit set, and the water resources that are near the infestations that you're looking to treat or deal with. The soil stuff, there's a lot of different things to look into. The moisture regime on site is important to look at. If you're going to be moving equipment in, you want to make sure that you do it when the soil is not wet and saturated. And if there are areas that are saturated, if you can figure out ways to circumvent those, that would be ideal. You can do things like put out traction mats if you need to move equipment through areas that are quite wet to minimize the amount of compaction of the soil there, because that's just going to make your job of restoring the site that much more difficult. For erosion, you want to be thinking about short-term and long-term erosion prevention. Short-term, if you can put a grass seed down or something just to help hold the soil in the near term after the blackberries have died off. You will get a little bit of residual erosion control from the roots of the blackberries even after they've been treated and killed. However, that drops off pretty quickly as the years start to stack up. Also, the topography is a consideration for getting access. If it's really steep, you're going to have increased erosion considerations, and you're also going to have a more difficult time knocking down the weeds or getting in whatever your control method that you choose happens to be. And for any ground disturbing activities, you're going to be looking at the microbiome in the soil. And if you're doing a lot of soil disturbance, you're going to be wanting to follow up with an amendment of a compost and tilling that into the soil to reintroduce the microbes, because you'll be losing a lot of that if you disturb the ground. And of course, the water that's adjacent to your site is equally important to consider when you're doing treatment options, especially for chemicals, but also any ground disturbance. You're going to be looking at wanting to avoid putting soil inputs into the waterway. That's a big no-no for water quality, and it has big impacts on salmon and other aquatic wildlife. So it's always important to be thinking about that while you're figuring out how to deal with your blackberries. Another consideration, birds. They will ground nesters especially will put their nests under blackberries. It's really great cover for them, and you want to make sure that any activities that you do in a blackberry patch are, if you can, try to avoid their nesting periods. And I've put the two outer bounds. It really depends on the season, though. I say late March through late July, but really it's, they follow whatever's going on with weather patterns and how much moisture that they got that year will all impact what the plants are doing. And the plants are going to be producing those insects that the birds are going to need for their nests. Most birds, I think it's over 90% of all bird species in our area require insects to be fed to the young to successfully raise their chicks. So it's a vital thing for them. So when the bugs are out, that's when the birds are going to be out picking them off and feeding them to their young. That's why, if you can, it's ideal if you can limit the disturbance of your work year over year to a 2/3 to 3/4 of the area if it's possible. And if you have upland sites, like for example, in this slide here, let me see if I can get a little pointer out. This upland area here, you could use this as your leave, keep these on site so that there's just a little bit of cover and habitat available before you remove the rest of those. And then that will give your planting time to develop and mature and start providing some resources that they could utilize on site. Another consideration, of course, is pollinators. The timing of if you're doing a chemical treatment, it's critical that you take them into consideration. And of course, I always like to toot this horn a little bit, that there's a big difference between our native pollinators like our bumblebees and our non-native pollinators like the honeybees. Honeybees are more of an agricultural escaped critter, I'd say. Just like cows with wings, basically. And you want to take those into consideration. For me, I don't worry as much when I see a large contingent of honeybees on site versus if I'm seeing more native pollinators. Like if you're saying the little mason bees or the bumblebees, then I'll take a lot more care to make sure that I'm not harming those populations because they are in steep decline. And one big thing that you can do is make sure that you choose a chemical option, A, that is not toxic to bees, and there are quite a few of them out there, and B, that you're not using a ready-made formulation. A lot of ready-made formulations of glyphosate especially are very toxic to bees. Primarily the name brands. I'm not going to get into specifics there, but if you choose an aquatic formulation with a good surfactant, just an aquatic approved one, you don't have to worry about the toxicity of bees as much. And of course, even better than choosing the right chemical is just avoiding the flowering period altogether if you can, which is typically June through August. And our bumblebees will appreciate you for your efforts. Got a little animation for you guys. I spent hours on that. For the fruit, they are actually not berries at all. And this is the botany nerd coming out here. They're actually aggregates of drupelets. That is bolded for a particular reason, which will become more apparent later. They're, of course, spread by animals. So that's where the maintenance comes in, because even if you successfully remove and control every single blackberry cane and root crown on your site, the birds will bring it back. And you'll also have deer that'll bring it back onto your site, and you'll just have to be taking care of that stuff, at least until your plants get high enough and you get enough shade in there to where the blackberries cannot persist. Fruit set is typically towards the end of August into September through October, depending on site conditions and weather patterns, of course. If you're looking to do a chemical treatment, it's usually good to take that into consideration. It's not as big of an issue. The herbicides that are available for aquatic blackberry control aren't really toxic to the animals that would be consuming them. But I still like to avoid, or at least take that in consideration when possible, just to be on the safe side in case there's something we're not aware of. For PPE, as I'm sure you all have encountered blackberries before, they're quite nasty. And if you're doing any type of work where you're going to be working with them mechanically, I highly recommend safety goggles to protect your eyes. Face shield alone is not sufficient because they can always find a way to get under that. Leather gloves are a good start. If you have chainmail, definitely go with that, because I've gotten stabbed through leather gloves many times. It's anything you can do to protect yourself out there. As far as pants, Carhartts are good, or you can get an upgraded option. Tin cloth pants are even better. Obviously, you want to balance the PPE use with the weather and what it is you're doing exactly. If you're just doing documentation, marching around the side there, you don't need to go in dressed for battle. But if you're getting in there and whacking that stuff down, then I highly recommend going in fully prepared. Long sleeve shirt is a must, and a hard hat is always a good option, especially if you take our Blackberry path creating tip to heart, because it's a little tricky. As far as mechanical and manual control goes, there are mixed results as far as how successful you can be with mowing and cutting. I think mowing and cutting is a good tool as a part of a more holistic approach to treating blackberries. I don't think it's necessarily a viable strategy unless it's a really new population. But because you'd be having to cut very frequently to be able to get those root reserves expended out of the extensive root systems that old growth blackberries seem to have. If you are going to go the manual control route, you have to make sure that after you cut back all the canes that you're digging and grubbing out the root crowns, and you want to find a time where the ground is pliable. I would recommend probably the spring would be a good option, mostly just because you're less likely to run into erosion issues because it's not going to be super rainy. Hopefully near the end of the spring would be ideal. And then of course soil considerations, you really have to hit it when the soil is actually pliable and wet, because otherwise you're just going to break things off and you're not going to really accomplish much, and it's just going to be really frustrating experience for you, and you're going to waste a lot of time. For biocontrol options, goats are a commonly referred to choice. A lot of landowners ask me about this, and from what I could see, I'm going to say right now, I've never used goats on a project. I have some misgivings about their utilization. However, from my understanding, they're about as effective as mowing. I'd say that if you were a landowner and you specifically had goats already on your property, letting them loose on your blackberries isn't a bad idea. But as far as an actual approach where you're paying somebody to bring their goat herds in, it could be done in a situation where you really don't want to use an herbicide for some reason. But you definitely, it's going to be a long, hard road. And goats, of course, are non-selective, so they will eat your desirable vegetation on site. And that's something you want to be looking at. And if you can corral them away from desirable vegetation, that would be a good idea, because they will eat everything. Yeah, it's kind of it for the goat thing. As far as rusts go, I did look into that a bit. And from my understanding, they are most active in wet areas like on the coast. And their virulence is really uneven. And what I mean by that is there are different varieties of blackberries that are more or less resistant to the rust. So while it might impact the blackberries to an extent, you're not going to be able to get full control or anything. It might be a nice benefit for us and slow them down a bit, because they are incredibly problematic. All right, we're revisiting the code word because you guys have been such a great audience. So the answer is, what kind of fruit do members of the Rubus genus, that's the genus that blackberries are in, make? Okay, I lied. I'm still going to make you wait until the very end, unless you already know, in which case, good on you. But we'll talk about it in the details a little bit further on here. It's not a berry, surprisingly. All right, we're going to move on to chemical control. This is the one that is probably it's not required for good control, but I would say it's definitely the most time effective way to go about controlling blackberries. And a lot of my advice here is specific for Washington. If you are from another state, the regulations are going to be different. In Washington, you must have an aquatic endorsement on your applicator license. And then you also have to have an aquatic noxious weed permit or general permit from, and these are both from the WSDA. They just switched over. The noxious weed permit used to be from the Department of Ecology, and now WSDA manages that. And you have to track your application of pesticides in aquatic areas by the stream that you're applying to and how much chemical you do. So there's a lot more paperwork involved when you're doing applications along waterways. And you would definitely want to get ahead of that and get that paperwork rolling as soon as you can so that you're ready to treat once the timing is right. There is a huge amount of stuff that you can deal with as far as the triclopyr formulations. There's been a lot of developments on that. There's three main types of triclopyr formulations. There's amines, which are generally less effective. However, they have a higher voltization rate, which means that they won't, and when it gets hot, it's not going to turn into a vapor and blow away and move off site. And that's typically the use case for an aquatic application. Would be if it's going to be very hot. I generally would recommend using a different chemical and timing your treatment so you can avoid using an amine formulation, but it is there if you need it. There's also the choline formulations, which are less corrosive, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And they're more concentrated, which is nice because you don't have to haul as much chemical around with you, but it is much more expensive, quite a bit more than the other options out there. I will say that I do prefer using the choline formulations because of the safety factors. But that's something that you'll have to figure out for your team, because you can use any of the formulations safely as long as you do it correctly. And of course, the ester formulations, which are mostly the standard option that you'd be using. You just have to be careful if it's starting to get around the 80s, because it becomes more volatile, and you'll start losing the herbicide, and you'll have more issues with drift after you apply. So I typically lean on the choline, but your use case might vary. And always for a triclopyr formulation, you want to be adding a non-ionic aquatic labeled surfactant, like a crop oil or a concentrate of some sort that suits your needs and is aquatically labeled. There's also, of course, glyphosate is an option for Blackberry control. The timing is more critical for glyphosate. You're going to be looking at usually that you want the ideal window. Usually right around in September is a good time to be treating with glyphosate. That's when the plants are bringing a lot of their resources down into the roots, September to October, depending on what the weather's doing. For triclopyr, it's a lot less timing specific. It's usually effective during a greater part of the year. Obviously, if you treat during the prime window in the fall, you'll get better control. But sometimes you can make adjustments to your plans based on what's happening out on your site specifically. After you've done your treatment, usually you want to wait about 2 to 4 weeks and follow up with a mulching, because just because you've killed most of the blackberries, you're still going to have some regrowth, and B, those canes persist for a long time on site. You really don't want to have to deal with those. So in summary, the most effective and efficient option, there's really two big ones. I like option one because it avoids a lot of the pitfalls with birds, pollinators, and the berries, is to apply herbicide, triclopyr or glyphosate in the late summer, early fall, then mulch down on site 2 to 4 weeks after. Alternatively, you can do a mow cut like early on in the growing season. and then apply a follow-up herbicide after they've fully leafed out, typically later in the summer. I would recommend in this situation, since it's probably going to be hotter, that you avoid using an ester formulation if it's hot. For triclopyr, you just kind of have to see what's going on out on site when you're going out to apply. For herbicide safety, you want to do all the same stuff you would do for pretty much any herbicide. I usually go to the nines when it comes to personal protective equipment with herbicides. I think it's just a responsible thing to do for your own health. But if you're using triclopyr, especially, you need to be really, really vigilant about wearing good safety goggles, because triclopyr can damage your eyes. It's really corrosive, and that's why we use the choline formulation with our program, because it is supposed to be safer for your eyes. It's still not great, and I wouldn't recommend putting it in your eyes, but it won't cause permanent damage as the other formulations can. For chemical resistant gloves, I always recommend putting dates on your gloves, just because they wear out over time, and usually after 3 years or so, depending on the material of your gloves, you want to throw them out just to be safe, because after continual exposure to sunlight and those chemicals, they start to break down, and they don't provide the good barrier between you and the chemicals that you're handling. Of course, when you're working with blackberries, punctures are common, so bring lots of extra gloves so that you can handle that as you're working, and always replace your gloves as soon as they're punctured. Protective pants, again, the Carhartts, the 10 cloth pants are great, depending on how hot it is, obviously, because you don't want to absolutely melt out there with your backpack sprayer on. It's pretty easy to overdo it. Long sleeve shirt, chemical resistant footwear, and a hat are all good things to have. And most important of all, read the label every time you apply. And I say that mostly because, especially if you're using a new formulation, but just in general, it's always good just to get a quick refresher in case you make a mistake. I know that when we switched to the choline formulation, that's a lot more concentrated. I did not take that into account when I was making my first load, and realized after the fact that, oh yeah, we can use a lot less herbicide to get the same result. And that's always a good thing to keep in mind there. And also to make sure you're not, any of your practices don't run afoul of the law, because the label is the law for pesticide applicators. And a little bonus I decided to give y'all, because I just love this technique we use. For accessing really dense patches of blackberries, it's often really difficult to get in, especially if you're doing like a chemical application. Getting access to everything can be really challenging. And what we do is we get a big old board, and I don't know if you can see it there. I'm going to see if I can draw on this. But right here, we have a little bit of grip tape that we run along there, usually 1 or 2 strips of it, depending on how thick it is, just so you have a little bit more grip on there while you're walking. And you throw the board down and you walk out onto it. And you want to be in your best PPE attire for this. I mean, you want to be dressed to the nines, every possible protection that you can get. Goggles, the hard hat. I mean, you want everything, because there is high likelihood that you will fall into the blackberries once or twice, and you want every bit of protection that you can have. But we do this when we're getting into some really thick patches of blackberries, so we can get good access. It really helps out just making things really smooth. Usually have a team out making those paths either ahead of time, or they'll start making the paths the same day while everyone else is loading up their sprayers and prepping for the work day. And we've had a lot of success doing it this way. And it makes it a lot easier too to know exactly where you've sprayed, and you just spray yourself out as you leave, and you get good coverage that way. and it's a much better process than trying to climb through things without any sort of implements to help you, or trying to cut things down, because then you're not going to get the same level of treatment in those pathways. Yes, but I will always emphasize the importance of having good PPE. I have been scraped up and stabbed, and pretty much everything that you can imagine with blackberries is transpired. And when you're trying to go through these tight corridors, even after making a nice path for yourself, it's still going to be grabbing at you and cutting you. And it's a pretty, the plant is trying to tell you to stay away. And we just have to be crazy and disregard what it's doing and telling us, so that we can knock it down and put in some plants afterwards. One last little extra bonus is sprayer upgrades. I'd say one of my favorite things to use is a PSI regulator. It acts as a check valve and also gives you a consistent flow rate at whatever PSI you desire. We typically use these red ones that are labeled at 21 PSI. It really helps keep a consistent flow rate through your nozzle, and you won't have to do nearly as much pumping. As long as you have 21 PSI worth of pressure in your tank, it will continue pushing it out, and it's a nice, slow, even rate. And it's a lot easier if you're calibrating your sprayer. It's so much easier when you have a consistent PSI you're working with. It's definitely worth the investment. I think they're $20 or $30 or something. They're pretty affordable. And of course, a backpack strap. I think it's criminal that some backpack manufacturers don't have them standard. But ones that have the hip strap and then the strap along your chest, it just makes it so much easier and more ergonomic to work with the backpack all day. And I cannot recommend them highly enough. I think it's criminal that they can sell them without those, because when you have a full tank that's 4 gallons and your backpack weighs 50 pounds and you have these tiny little straps that cut into your shoulders all day, that's no way to live. So let's do the code word, shall we, for real this time. I'm not going to mess around with you guys. You've been great so far. So what kind of fruit do members of the Rubus genus make? Answer is an aggregate of drupelets. That's right, friends. The code word today is drupelets. So let's put our WSDA license numbers and the code word drupelets into the chat box, so that we can get you all the credits for that if you are looking for those. And let's see here. I think that was about all I wanted to talk about today, but I'll leave this up for a little bit. If you have any questions, I'll have my email here in a little bit, especially for any particular recommendations as far as Blackberry control. But I will say that after you're done killing your blackberries, you need to have a good follow-up plan for planting. Highly recommend you're going to have to go pretty heavy with your canopy cover to create enough shade on site to keep blackberries and things like reed canary grass from coming back onto your sites. And blackberry control is always going to have to be at the landscape level. There's really no escaping it. And you're just going to have to make your peace and pick your battles. If you're trying to control a blackberry patch without a restoration plan to follow that up, it's not gonna succeed. It'll just knock it back for a period of time, but at the end, it'll always come back. That's really the long and short of it. Justin, is there anything else we need to do with the license number and to make sure everyone gets their credit for attending today?
Yeah, well, just because we showed the code word doesn't mean that it's over. So do plan to stick around once you do this. And yeah, just to be clear, do enter the code word, your full name, and your pesticide license number into the chat. And we will save the chat, and that will be how we verify your attendance and participation. So do that. And yeah, if you have no other slides, Brad, I think we're ready to go into the panel Q&A so that we can answer some of their questions about IPM.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. Jason Anderson, when you're ready, go ahead and join us. Fantastic. Well, this has been so much fun, everyone. I'd just like to thank you all again for participating. And for the audience, if you have questions that you'd like us to answer, do put that into the chat, and we'll do our best to get your question answered. I guess I'll lead off while people are thinking, because it takes a minute to think and write. When we're talking about integrated pest management, it's Jason had mentioned identification and monitoring, and a periodic inventory of your site or sites is something that you should be doing. I guess that made me wonder, how often should you be doing that periodic inventory? It seems like a lot of times we focus on the active site, but when do you go back and do a full inventory? I guess maybe Brad, if you're comfortable answering, and then we can go to Jason and Ann.
Yeah. So for monitoring, I like to go pretty often as you're getting rolling. So after treatment, you'd come back that same year, follow up, see what's going on site, see if there's any changes. Usually if you clear out a species, you'll see some things growing back in, and you want to be documenting that to see if it's good, and that those are positive things you want on site, or B, if they're more invasive secondaries that are coming in to treat. And then as you go, you can usually delay your monitoring, but I'd say yearly to start. And then as you get more established, you can do every other year, 3 years, just depending on A, how much money you have to actually fund that work, and B, what you're seeing, because I think what you see on site will really dictate how often you need to come back.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And once again, folks, enter your questions into the chat and we'll answer them. Jason, what's your approach?
Well, I'd have to echo what Brad just said, in the sense of when a control effort has been completed, obviously you want to follow up and evaluate your efficiency and how things are looking. I'd also introduce the idea that you might want to consider the type of weeds that you were controlling for, and taking into account when those particular plants might best be detected, taking into consideration flowering time on some flowering plants. Or for Blackberry, obviously, they are one of the plants that do retain their leaves throughout the winter, when a lot of the native trees and shrubs drop their leaves. And so sometimes those blackberries can pop right out at you, because they're one of the few plants that are green on a site in the winter, early spring, before a lot of those native shrubs get going. So I'd consider those two things as you're kind of developing your monitoring plan for a given year or for years to come, and to try to take into those seasonal differences in the vegetation that you're seeking to look at. And also, don't be afraid to look at it in more than one season, because certain plants are more prevalent in the spring or early summer, as opposed to, say, a fall time, and depending on those bloom or those flowering times as well.
Super. Thank you. Anything to add, Ann?
No, it really depends on your resources and time. When I was just managing one site, I could monitor all the time. But when I was working for a nonprofit that had a lot of sites, we couldn't monitor all the sites all the time. So we just would do them periodically, maybe every 3 years. Probably should have been more.
Great. Well, our first question came in. Can you discuss some resources for developing an integrated vegetation management plan? And there's a follow-up, but I think we'll start with that. What resources would be helpful if you're developing an integrated vegetation management plan?
Well, I'll start off and take an opportunity to answer that. I think the first thing that you probably would want to do is make a good list of all the sites all the properties that you would be including in this plan and get a sense of where they're located, proximity to wherever your home office is, and then try to make some kind of a reasonable estimate of the time that you would need on site for all these different places, taking into account the size of the different sites. Larger sites might need more time when you're going out and evaluating them. Smaller sites, a little bit less time. Perhaps you can combine a couple of sites in a day's trip so that you can hit more than one site as you are traveling around within the area that you work. And so doing an initial inventory, kind of setting up baseline conditions, getting good maps of the sites, understanding the property boundaries, also understanding what some of the neighboring land use is like and how that might impact things that are happening on your site, understanding what's upstream or upslope from you, downstream and downslope. Do that baseline inventory, conduct some vegetation assessments, document what you see on site, come back to the office, write that up, get kind of a baseline condition established for each site, and then start thinking about what you see out there in terms of where you would want to go. Are you identifying any large patches of those Class A's that need to be treated sooner rather than later? And then are you seeing large patches of Class B's or C's that you might be able to wait and include those in a broader restoration program or scheme in the future, and start with a prioritization, make a matrix of sorts so that you can identify priority and size, and that might help you to decide how you want to spend your time and resources, because as we all know, there are limited time and resources, and prioritizing both of those items are going to help you to try to essentially keep what you have in good shape, in good condition, and then slowly work toward those sites where you're going to need a larger amount of investment of time and resources in order to affect those changes in the vegetation.
Awesome, thank you. Anything to add, Ann or Brad?
I have a little tidbit for monitoring and figuring out what we should be treating. I really lean heavily on using a GIS database that has all of our sites, and I can query depending on what the date is, which sites still need to be treated. Because if it's something like giant hogweed, then I have like a time frame for that, and I can just set that in there so that if it's this early in the season, there's not a whole lot going on, but as the season develops, if it's like early spring, I can pull those in, and it helps me at least get like a full list of everything that needs to be dealt with. And then I can prioritize from there to make sure that I'm hitting everything. And I mean, it's everything else that Jason said, it definitely applies. I like using that to keep track of things for our program, to simplify and make sure that we're actually hitting everything.
Nice. Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, I guess a question to Ann. It seems like when we're developing our plans and we revisit it annually, we got to be on the lookout for new noxious weeds, newly listed species, as well as newly introduced species. What time of year does that list typically change, and how would one become aware that there's some new things on the landscape?
So it goes in a yearly cycle. This time of year, from January 1st to the end of April, is when people can propose new species to be listed. Anyone can make a proposal. You can also go to us or to your county weed board for help making a proposal. It doesn't have to be anything serious. You just be like, oh, I want to list this species. It doesn't have to be a bunch of research. And then I do the research for you. So after that, throughout the summer is when the Noxious Weed Committee starts to look at those proposals, and eventually they propose things to go to hearing. And then so the hearing is in November, and that's when there's a public hearing. People put in their input on the new list. The next day is the vote from the board, and after that is when those new species are updated. There's news releases before the hearing and after the hearing. And I believe I'm not sure if it's December 1st or January 1st that the new list officially takes effect. And that's when the new species that had been proposed earlier in the year are officially noxious weeds. And then counties have, I believe, 90 days from that point to make their own lists. So they might select things. So you can go to your county coordinator and your county noxious weed board, and they will have the list of things that are in that county that they want to be controlled or are legally required to be controlled. So there's like the state list and the county list, and the county list is going to be a lot more specific to what is in your area. And there's going to be things on that county list that aren't even on the state list that they still want to be controlled or want to be monitored.
Awesome, thank you. So another question, do any of you have experience in spraying over the top of conifers to control reed canary grass?
I don't, but I imagine that you could use a grass-specific herbicide, but then you would be killing any grass and potentially any monocots. So like oftentimes like irises, camas, hyacinths, things that are monocots like grasses can be impaired by grass-specific herbicides just because they're more closely related to them than they are to broadleaf plants. So if you aren't worried about hitting other grasses or hitting other plants, I believe you would be able to use a grass-specific herbicide and not injure the conifer trees. But and if you use too much herbicide, then you can injure anything, not just the grasses. So grass-specific herbicide can still kill non-grasses if used higher than label recommendations.
And I'm not 100% positive on this, but I'm pretty sure that the grass-specific herbicides, at least for Washington, I don't think there's any that are labeled for aquatic use. I would love to be proven wrong on that because that would be a great tool to have for combating reed canary grass. But yeah, it would be something I would definitely make sure that there is a label for that particular use before proceeding with something like that.
Great.
And we usually use mowing too to keep the canary reed grass down, and then we can use a less selective chemistry for knocking down the reed canary grass.
Fantastic. Oops,
I'd
sorry, go
echo
ahead.
what Brad said. Yeah, using a combination of techniques can be effective for grasses in and amongst trees, conifers included. Yep.
If they are big established trees and you do have the resources to do a controlled burn, you can do a controlled burn on the reed canary grass. The fire will kill the reed canary grass, and if you have like enough trained staff, like JBLM would be able to do this easily. DNR can do this. Center for Natural Lands Management and Eco Studies Institute do this, where they'll do controlled burns and they'll stop the flames from being able to get into the crowns of the conifers, but that won't work for like a stand of saplings.
Great, thank you for that. The next question, I think to Jason to lead off with. Jason, I liked what you're promoting of using traditional ecological knowledge to inform our practitioner ecological knowledge. If someone's newer to restoration and invasive species management, what tips would you have in order to help us educate ourselves and gain access to that traditional ecological knowledge?
All right. Certainly, I would recommend, like with a lot of stuff, utilize the information that you can get on hand from free sources first. Internet searches are going to provide you with a lot of good information. There's print resources as well, historical documents and books that you can access. There's a lot of those documents that are available from different sources. I think some tribes often do have libraries, and so you can always contact different tribes and inquire if they have sources of books on that nature. Perhaps it can be something that can be lent. I would then say that if you are working within a specific geographic area, do take the time to reach out to the different tribes, try to get in touch with their Natural Resources Department personnel or Cultural Resources Department personnel, and take the time to build relationships there, because like with any group of people just show up off the street and start asking questions. People are a little hesitant to respond to those questions until you do form those good relationships. And then ultimately over time, you can start to benefit from some of the traditions and practices from different organizations. And I would say that there's also many people throughout the community that practice traditional knowledge in other ways, sportsmen's communities, hunting communities, gathering folks who are weavers. They collect native plants and they understand the best times of the years to do so. And so different practices, kind of thinking outside of the box, and trying to get connected with communities of people who do spend times out of doors, recreating and enjoying themselves outside. Then those are the groups with whom I think you can gather a lot of information for the area in which you're interested in learning about.
Fantastic, thank you. Ann or Brad, do you have anything to add? Well, we talked a little bit about short-term versus long-term funding. That's something Brad mentioned. And Jason, you alluded to the long-term needs for stewardship. When it comes to funding, it seems like there are some challenges with long-term funding. Do you have any recommendations you can make to participants that may be interested in starting a program or maybe enhancing a program they have?
That is a difficult nut to crack. Oftentimes when we're talking about restoration of sites, we're focusing very much site specific as opposed to programmatic type activities. And if you do have an active restoration grant that focuses on a site or a suite of sites, then I would encourage you to try to incorporate activities in there that allows you a little bit of flexibility in how those funds can be spent, whether or not that's flexibility within the time frame of the grant or the geography in which you hope to work, so that you can try to incorporate some of these activities as part of a broader restoration strategy, and look at it as a long-term commitment in terms of you want to be revisiting sites year after year, and say you're able to spend a course of time at one particular site doing restoration work. Take the time when you're on that site to go revisit some of the spots that you've previously worked on and document conditions and changes. Oftentimes when you're documenting those conditions, say you're able to successfully treat a large patch of blackberry, and you can come back a couple years later and some jewelweed has moved in. Well, it's good to document those conditions so that you can make the case to the granting organizations that you do need to do some follow-on work, whether or not that's another treatment for jewelweed, and then perhaps look at reestablishing some native plants that can compete with some other type of an invasive plant that might be ready and willing to pounce on that open space. And so it is a challenge, and I do want to make the case that when it does come for grant funding and work within riparian areas, we need to start taking a long-term approach. We know that these projects take time. We're going to be managing the transition from one vegetation type community, whether or not that's a dominant invasive presence, to that transition to controlling invasives and establishing native plants. But then we also want to be able to have the flexibility and the long-term follow through to be able to steward those plants into and past establishment phase, so that the process can proceed with the regeneration from whatever seed source is going to be on site, and then we can get closer to success in that sense of we can start backing off and the process can help take care of itself, and we can focus our efforts elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Anything to add, Ann or Brad?
I'll just echo Jason's point on the fact that most grant funds for projects neglect the long-term maintenance needs of the projects, and often that's going to be left to the implementing organization to do. And I know that we're lucky enough to have support from our organization to do those as part of our operational funds, but Figuring out how to do that out, my only advice really is if you can plan to do as many projects as close together as possible, so that if you can just walk from the site where you're doing active grant work and doing your monitoring and your follow-up work and try to minimize the amount of time that you're spending off grant, that would be the only thing I can really think of. That's how I usually try to plan things for grants, but it is definitely challenging, and I hope it's something that can be addressed in the future, because I swear every time new grant rounds come out, the timing is shorter and shorter, and we get to the point where you're going to only have 1 year of implementation time, and then the rest of it, all that maintenance is going to be on you. So maybe it'll go the other way.
Well, we can only hope. So we're going through the questions. We're about wrapped up. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was about integrated pest management and prevention. And I really appreciated Jason highlighting prevention, because it's a key component of integrated pest management, but sometimes can be overlooked. What preventative tools are you incorporating into your programs, or what's working for you and to ensure that you're not introducing new problems to your sites or moving problem species from one site to another?
Yeah, we deal with this quite often with our projects. Sanitation is critical for all equipment when you're moving it from site to site, both for personnel and equipment. I mean, if you're using an ATV, you need to really be cleaning that out, all the different places where mud can go, because that mud will have invasive species seeds in there. We have that we've accidentally spread garlic mustard on one of our projects, which was not great, and we've been doing intensive work to get those removed, and also to make sure that it hasn't spread off site. And so far we've been successful in stopping it from spreading from where it is, but that's still 10 years worth of work that is going to be required minimum to keep that garlic mustard under control and stop it from spreading. Like Jason was saying in his presentation, any way that you can prevent things from getting started will save you a huge amount of headache and money in the long term. And really prevention is the biggest thing that you can do. And for sanitation practices, just keeping all your gear clean between sites is really important. Even if it does increase the cost in the short term, those costs will be delivered onto you 100-fold if you fail to stop the spread from site to site.
There
Yeah.
is a weed-free hay and mulch program that the state has. I believe it's at WSDA level, I'm not sure. And then one of the county coordinators of one of the noxious weed boards is working on starting a a weed-free gravel program as well. Another thing to look at is your seed mix that you're putting into a restoration site. A species that was just added to the noxious weed list in December this year was wild basil. It was likely in the seed mix used by the U.S. Forest Service when they were seeding after logging many decades ago, and now it's a noxious weed in Washington because they didn't realize it wasn't native or whatever reason.
One other thing to mention, following up with Brad's comment, mud control is important, and so cleaning all your equipment, but then also don't neglect your personal gear, your boots, your rain gear, anything where seeds can get on there, especially in the summertime. We've started using blowers in the field to try to blow off our tractors after we get done mowing, try to leave as many of those seeds on site. If we're mowing through reed canary grass, thistle, things like that. And then also leaving time at the end of the day when you bring your equipment back, mowers, handhelds, ride-on mowers, ATVs, things like that. Take the time to wash them down. That extra 10, 15 minutes at the end of the day might prevent you, like Brad said, with years of work to follow up. And it is a cultural thing. You need to start practicing it and making it part of the day so as that it's just habit, and your equipment goes in the shop clean. It's ready to be drying overnight, and then be ready to go for the next day.
Great. Well, final question, and once again, put the code word, your full name and license number into the chat. If you don't do this, you will not be receiving credit. Just one final warning. Yeah, so I like that we're talking about restoration, and that's really kind of the full circle of why we're talking about this in the first place, to improve habitat. What resources are available to help choose seed mixes or choose the correct plants for restoration? I often get questions from the public that are trying to revegetate a slope, for example, and don't want to plant the wrong thing, which is great, but I often don't really know where to direct them. So where would you suggest folks go?
I like reaching out to the conservation groups like in your area. So like the conservation districts or local nonprofits. So like I'm mostly based in Lewis and Thurston County. So I like the Lewis County Conservation District, and also really like the Native Plant Salvage Project. They're really great at helping identify plants, at least on the western side of the Cascades. And Great Plant Picks is a group that can help you pick plants, but they are mostly garden based. So a lot of things are going to be non-native, non-invasive ornamentals.
I'd say one of the first steps that you can do is, again, start familiarizing yourself with different vendors who specialize in native seeds. There's becoming quite a few now vendors that focus on native seeds, seed mixes, and there are some that will work with you to do custom mixes when and if necessary. And I think understanding your site, understanding your soils, understanding your area and your terrain and things like that is the first step, but then reaching out with them and working with them, because they do have the experience with understanding all those site conditions and how the seed mixes can perform based on what you know about the site. And we have had good luck with quite a few seed mix companies. And if anybody has any specific needs for a seed mix, I'd be happy to share with you the vendors that we've worked with. So you can email me if you'd like, or also do internet searches on your own time to figure out who those vendors are. But they're out there.
I did just put a link into chat to the Noxious Weed Control Board website. On the bottom of that page is a list of native seed vendors and native plant vendors. Some of them do only wholesale, some of them do wholesale and non-wholesale, some of them will make custom seed mixes for you. I've worked with a bunch of them when I used to work on a native seed farm myself. So some of them are really good at really helping you describe the site you have, and they'll help you pick the species to put on that site.
Great. Anything to add, Brad?
I like going to your local Native Plant Society chapter because you're going to have all the most hardcore botany nerds there that can help you figure out exactly what sounds good. And you can always throw a species list at them, and then they can, talk about it and come up with, suggestions and help you improve it if you have a baseline based on your site conditions. So you can use that. Things like iNaturalists are pretty good for just giving you an idea if a species exists in your area and grows there. It's not perfect, but it is pretty good. And it's probably the most in-depth resource I've seen up there with like the Oregon Plant Atlas. If you use that as well, it can tell you things grow in your area and where they grow.
Great. Well, this has been so much fun, everyone. Thank you. And it's been great to have this conversation with the panelists. And thanks so much for your time, everyone. We know how to prevent and stop invasive species, but it takes all of us working together across jurisdictions. So I think this presentation showed, that we're all working in one comprehensive way to protect and preserve our riparian habitats, and would invite you all to participate as well. And talking a little bit about organizations that do restoration and invasive species management, I've got to pitch a webinar tomorrow that is focused on the Washington Conservation Corps. And our speaker, Peter Nevin, will be talking about the Washington Conservation Corps, which is a statewide organization that does a lot of different restoration and planting and invasive species management projects. So if you're interested in learning more about the Washington Conservation Corps, go to invasivespecies.wasandwashington.gov as in government. And there's also a full list of other webinars happening all throughout the week. So I thank you all and wish you happy Invasive Species Awareness Week, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.